Okay. Previously on the Geo Kino show, we heard about two conceptualizations of procurement, a transactional one and a relational one. And I just suggested that South Africa has got a transactional conceptual model of procurement, which is evidently not a fit for purpose when you're wanting to use procurement for innovation purposes. So, put differently, our conceptual model of public procurement is not a good fit for the use of public procurement as a demand-side instrument in innovation policy. If we are to use public procurement as an instrument of support in innovation, there are, in my view, a number of adjustments that we will have to make in how we conceptualize public procurement. That is, we will have to adjust our conceptual model of public procurement towards a stronger relational one if procurement is going to be a useful instrument in support of innovation. In our procurement practice, we will have to explore more relational conceptions of public procurement. That is, thinking longer term and less transactional about acquisition. We'll have to adopt a broader view on who the partners are to the acquisition. The current narrow transactional paradigm of a discrete agreement of sale between the procuring institution and the supplier must give way to a richer network of relationships within which the acquisition is situated. That could, for example, include a more direct and immediate role for beneficiary communities, a less arm's length approach to subcontractors, a differentiated view of distinct parts of public sector in relation to acquisition, and a clearly articulated role for civil society. Of course, the formal framework in which procurement is done must allow for this relational approach. That is, laws, regulations, and policies will have to change to fully internalize a relational approach. Fortunately, in South Africa, we are now exactly in the process of doing just that. We are in the process of reforming our formal framework. So we have an important window of opportunity to insert a relational paradigm into the formal framework. However, adjusting the formal framework is really the easy part of the adjustment, although it may not always feel so easy to everyone involved in the current law reform process. The much more challenging and arguably more important adjustment lies in shifting actual practices, how procurement is done, how specifications are drafted, in what way the market is approached. And here I deliberately put the market in inverted commas, because the solicitation exercise may not involve approaching a traditional existing commercial market, but a completely alternative pool of supply. Shifting practice includes things such as the way that actors in the system, both public and private, think about public procurement, the culture within the public procurement system, and the competencies required to operate successfully in a relational procurement paradigm, again, for both public and private sector actors. While these adjustments are tough, there is literature and there are real-world examples on each and every one of these required adjustments to guide us. We've seen this in the two presentations we've already had today, both at local and global levels. Both Drs. Cruz and Kahn's paper and Professor Etler's paper presented us with a wealth of data on what facilitates, that is, produce and diffuse innovation by firms through public procurement and what does not. The preliminary question is whether there is the will to seriously look at each of these areas of adjustment and to intentionally insert the learning and examples into all dimensions of public procurement. My perception, and here I conclude, is that there's perhaps now a real will emerging in South Africa to actually do this work. This puts the ball in the court of the public procurement community, practitioners, academics, policymakers, to explore the options available to us and to frame those options in ways that they can be adopted in our system. I hope that our continued deliberations here will help us to accelerate this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kino. I think you might have dodged a bullet there because of the technical error. We don't know how much time you actually took of what you had said. It would be less than 20 minutes, but thank you so much for a thoroughly thought-provoking conversation, and I would imagine there would be many questions that flow from that. I certainly have a couple of questions for you following that very engaging presentation. Now, in the audience as well is Dr. Barbara Allen, Deputy Head, School of Government, Wellington School of Business and Government, Victoria University of Wellington, all the way from New Zealand. This is where the dynamic changes, the word New Zealand. So I'll stop there. Dr. Barbara Allen, please come through. Say no more.
I just didn't want you to take all my jokes. Where's the clicker? Wait, where is it?
Clicker. This one.
Is that it?
That's it. Green is just going forward.
Okay. Right.
Barbara, that screen there as well.
Thank you very much, NRF and Stellenbosch, for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be here. Thank you. Green button. There we go. Tēnā koutou e homa, ko Mount Martin te manga, ko Ottawa River te awa, no toku whanau, arangi ko tarana, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. So that is a introduction, a welcome, an explanation a little bit about who I am in the Māori language from New Zealand. And it's very much now embedded in what we do and who we are. Public officials almost all start any talk with this sort of thing. Some people are better than others. Getting a hold of the accent is a challenge. I'm giving it a go. And I'll come back to why this is so important in a few minutes. But that's a picture of Deep River, Ontario, Canada, where I'm from, in the autumn. So some fantastic views from there. It's a company town for nuclear energy research labs. Well, I've had some nice conversations about that with some of the NRF folks. Right. Now, I'm a public policy, public management, public admin scholar. Depending on what country you're talking about, we use different terms for that. Did my training in Canada, and you can see there the vastness of it. I was a military officer for a number of years, and then small business operations manager, and then I went back into academia. And at the end of my PhD, which is in public policy, I went to undertake a great opportunity in the UK to do research in public procurement. Now, this is quite a long time ago now, and it was a great opportunity. There was basically no one to talk to in Canada at the time about the things I was interested in, so I was chasing it, and chasing, of course, a good job. So I had some exposure to that environment, to the European Union environment, and learned a lot along the way. Now, there's England, you'll be thinking, now she's gone to the other side of the world, which is true. I'm now in New Zealand. It's really important to me to have lived experience in terms of looking at public policy, from everything from major project acquisitions to social services, which I'm also really interested in. So I've had that opportunity now. And I mean, that picture belies the expanse of that space, right? The Pacific, it's an entirely new demography for me to learn. My students are from Southeast Asia and the islands, and the Pacific environment is fascinating and shows us a lot of other kinds of developmental and economic issues with regards to procurement. So this has just been a fascinating journey, and I'm really pleased to be able to continue. I did a short project in Uganda with Stellenbosch University a number of years ago on SMEs and whether they were getting prepared for international export. I can't claim to have much more knowledge than that about the African procurement environment, except for after this conference, of course. Thank you very much. But these experiences along the way have certainly fed into my understanding. But, you know, aside from the maps, what do you really think about when you think about Canada? Knee deep in snow? That's not me, but it could be me. Of course, the Westminster Parliament in the UK, classic images, right? And then New Zealand, maybe you think of Lord of the Rings, but at the moment, this is what we think about our poor All Blacks. I didn't know how I was going to come. There's nothing sadder than the All Blacks having lost, like that dejection, but it's probably better than the alternative in terms of my coming to visit. So congratulations. Right, so let's get on. I've sort of constructed this in terms of a paper in development, and I have three aspects to my argument. Some of this we explored yesterday for those who were at the colloquium, but I'll go briefly back through some of that. So firstly, the political and institutional context and antecedents to procurement and innovation must be understood if they're not already in place. Are there minimum conditions that we need to see whether innovation can move forward quickly? Policy can be open or closed, but neither guarantees innovation. I'll come back to what I mean by that. And I think we're facing literally a tsunami of new pressures on public procurement. It's changed a lot in the 25 years that I've been looking at it, and in other ways hasn't changed at all. But there's a lot of things coming at it, and I think we need an acceleration, which a lot of us have been arguing for as well. Just a really sort of short conceptualization about how I think about procurement. So I come from the public policy point of view, and I think about the policy as the values and objectives that are made explicit through laws, norms, and guidelines. There's the procurement instrument, which has a whole load of elements to it that some of our speakers are talking about, and then the activities and processes that take place from that. So just so you sort of understand where I'm coming from. And my interest is primarily innovation in procurement policy, as opposed to what some of our other speakers are talking about, but it's good that we're coming at it from all different directions, I think. So innovative procurement in the process, and of course, others are talking about procurement for innovation. Now, I look at pathways of policy innovation in my research and in my teaching. There's many models, and we have, for example, we can have radical innovation, incremental, cyclical. Punctuated equilibrium is a term that we use in public policy, where there's a big moment in time, a change, and then it settles back down to sort of a stable situation again. And then there's sense making, and these have various titles with large literatures around them, but it's quite interesting to think about them in terms of procurement policy, and are we seeing what exactly is going on here? And I think that's important because it does help us to think through what's happening, what could happen, and that's, you know, arms us for better decision making, hopefully. What I've learned living on 3 continents, I like this notion of many faces of public sector innovation. Comes from Blug and Brock. These are just, of course, my sort of learnings and reflections on some of this, but I think procurement inclusion in trade agreements, as globalization has expanded, has been a key aspect of change over time. And I'll come back to some of these ideas briefly. I do think the rise of the procurement profession has happened from what I've seen across the world in different places, in different ways, and we're not there, but there's been a big change, and there's a professionalization of procurement going on, which is quite powerful. And I think it'll be good for all of us to be able to sort of ride on that. And I think this recognition of spending through public procurement as a driver of public value or public good has particularly taken off in the last 5 to 10 years. It was always there, but it's gotten much more explicit, and we're asking procurement now to do everything. Which question mark, right? Can it do everything, including be efficient and value for money. Maybe, but this is why we have to understand it and do more. So I do see some of these positive trends, and yet, so I come from a, what would be termed in the literature and in the grey literature, a pretty good system. New Zealand's procurement system is underperforming. Do not have good information about the value our procurement expenditure is achieving or how it is contributing to our priorities. The system is not as efficient as it should or could be, and unforeseen risks, delays, and cost increases are impacting delivery. The system needs a reset. So this was in a cabinet paper just a couple of years ago. It's getting to the top of the pile in terms of attention, in terms of at least a nod in the right direction. And this has driven a procurement reform program, another one. So we do have some connection between the highest levels in terms of politics and the sort of the policy level and even at the implementation level. However, there's still a lot of problems in New Zealand public procurement. So my first argument, the political and institutional context and antecedents to procurement and innovation must be understood, if not already in place. So some of you will recognize this from yesterday. It's just a very simple heuristic sort of that sort of lays out politics, policy, and partnerships as three key contexts where innovation can be put in the middle. Academics love Venn diagrams and 2x2s, but they can be useful to help us organize our thoughts. So you can read, hopefully you can see it, not too badly, what's in those categories for me. And I think that the trade agreements is there for New Zealand. Indigenous relationships and the Indigenous treaty is super important. I'm going to come back to that. Policy, regulation, and guidance, interesting where different countries are at. South Africa coming on with its procurement bill, the UK changing quite a bit over the last little while, and New Zealand is a different system, again, based on a British system, but it's gone its own way. So I'll come back to that. I think these partnerships are super important. It speaks actually to the relationships that Hill was talking about as being critical in that environment. Now, this is going to be a bit old, but it's a procurement management model on the side, institutional rules and formal rules and informal institutions, sort of the classic elements of procurement management in the middle and the regulation on the side. And I've just sort of added innovation. And many of the speakers are talking about, well, where are we coming at in terms of innovation when we're talking about this side of procurement policy and innovation. I quite like this framework because of this notion of the institutional rules, formal and informal, that are recognized explicitly as being important to making this whole ecosystem work. So we can't ever sort of let that go. Now, I put this in red because I always want to remind myself to emphasize this in a New Zealand context. Now, we have the Treaty of Waitangi, which was signed in the 1840s between the Crown and the Māori tribes, some of the Māori tribes. And New Zealand recognizes this as a live and evolving and continuing to be relevant treaty, and it governs how we manage the relationships between us. And there is, however, as you can imagine, lots of issues. There's an English version and there's a Māori version, and they are different. So there's a lot of interpretation going on, and it's, like I said, it's a live process, which is fascinating. And for example, the words governance and sovereignty are not the same in these different languages, and I would expect that would come up in lots of different languages. But that's pretty fundamental, right? So Māori agreed to be governed, but they did not agree to give up their sovereignty. So this shapes the relationships as we go forward. And that's for New Zealand, I can't almost overemphasize the importance of that in our day-to-day relationships and in our day-to-day governing, including in the procurement policy space and procurement for innovation, which I'll come on to in a second. So the second part of my argument, open or closed for innovation, this is just sort of they're not the they're not where I'm going to land, I think, in terms of the definitions. But by open, I mean a flexible trust-based system, which is New Zealand is an example of. We don't have a procurement law. We're not writing a bill. We have a series of guidelines. We have a series of other acts that you have to follow in terms of health and safety and commerce and electronic commerce and all those sorts of things. But there's no overarching legislation, which, as you can imagine, is quite an interesting situation, that we don't really have a challenge function in the way that the European Union does, or the way that you would be having here. And that's the system that we're operating in. It provides opportunities. It also has its drawbacks. But I think there's things to be learned, right, from looking at these different systems, and how does it actually work? What are the bits that could work for us, and what are the bits that couldn't? In my exposition here, I just talked about closed as being the highly regulated approach, legislation with legal balance for challenge. And I think my point is just that innovation happens in both, in different ways, and there's different opportunities, but the conditions are really important around that. For example, again, in New Zealand, at the policy level, our entry into the World Trade Organization Agreement on Government Procurement was a fundamental moment in the changes in the procurement system in New Zealand. So there's a whole process you need to go through to prepare to become a member of that agreement on government procurement, which was very much a disciplining exercise, because you have to meet certain thresholds. You have to prove that you're going to, use the principles of fair, open competition. You have to show how your procurement systems are at least moving in that direction. So we became fully accession in 2015. And I would argue that that's one of those punctuated equilibrium moments where big change, and now we're sort of in this steady state. New Zealand is in a lot of different treaties. We're at the end of a very long supply chain. It's critical. We export a lot, and these treaties are fundamental to the way we operate. I would argue that the broader outcomes agenda is probably incremental innovation, and I'll explain that a little bit more in a second. Collabs, if anyone wants to talk about that, it's co-design, bringing stakeholders together to provide input at a policy level as well as a practice level. It's been a fascinating process for the last couple of years. And the smart city agenda, I have a PhD student who's studying Seoul, Busan in South Korea, and Wellington and Christchurch, and looking at procurement in the smart city evolution. So really interesting that there's a lot of activity going on in cities, right? And the smart city agenda is really moving, and those countries that are investing hugely in the smart city agenda are doing some really interesting things. I talked a bit about this when we joined the World Trade Organization. That was a moment that was super important. I don't think South Africa is a member. I don't know if you're in the middle of those conversations, but it's interesting to think about as in terms of the sort of features that an outside organization requires you to look at. So it allows you to say, well, it's the WTO that wants us to do that, and it's good stuff. So it's sort of a way to put discipline into the process. Right. I mentioned broader outcomes, so that's an agenda around changing from efficiency, transaction-based procurement to pursuing other kinds of priorities, as well as efficiency, right? So there's been a whole set of policy work being done. These are the priorities currently for New Zealand public procurement: increase New Zealand businesses' access to government procurement, and so on and so forth. And you can read them up. We got net zero emissions in there. Interesting. The first bullet is largely about the Māori economy, the Indigenous economy, and creating a strong, vibrant, diverse supplier line into government. So that's been another one of those, I would argue, incremental processes of innovative procurement policy, but it's a work in progress, and they're long way to go still. This is part of the latest set of reforms, this progressive procurement policy, which is a about levering the Māori economy and really putting effort into that. And they've targeted, and lots of governments have done this in different ways, but in this case, the social value of engaging Māori businesses, an intentional approach to government spend where at least 8% of the total number of annual procurement contracts must be awarded to Māori businesses. It was 5% last year. They met it, so they decided, I don't know why you go from 5 to 8, but we look back and forth between New Zealand, Australia and New Zealand all the time, and we're sort of bouncing back and forth. Australia was getting ahead of us on that one. You'll notice though that number of annual procurement contracts is an interesting measure. It's just a number. It doesn't say anything about quality or the million other things that could be in that, but it's a starting point, and it's quite a powerful starting point. And a lot of the reforms around procurement policy have been in this area. Huge amount of resources put into it, because it comes back to the treaty, and it comes back to why I'm actually speaking Māori, because it's so integral to how we work in New Zealand, and a successful Indigenous economy is seen as the future for New Zealand. Because we have to answer to the treaty. We are partners in the treaty. It's not just a thing over there, right? It's an everyday living thing, and we have an active political party, Māori political party as well. I was recently in Seoul, oh my God. I had never been to a city quite that big. I'm sure many of you have been to bigger, but it's part of that smart city agenda I was talking about. And I was struck by the fact that you can't order food to a human being. Some of you have been there. You have to punch in what you want into a machine. It's like when you use an ATM, but this is for your food. And I couldn't understand why they didn't want to talk to me when I went to the counter. They're just pointing me over to, and then there's not necessarily English, of course, on those counters. So, but the problem with a smart city doing that kind of a procurement is what happens, right? There's immediately you go, well, not everybody's going to be able to use those machines, but you know, a large part of the population is not equipped. There's a lot of smart city undertakings that are similar, right? So you have to think of it in an inclusive way. One of the things that Seoul is doing, it has, I think, 135 spots where you can go as an elderly person to learn about the internet and how to use these machines and all the things that are coming, smartphones and all of that. So it's a very focused, practical response to, oh, we're doing that. Oh, well, these people are being left behind, so we actually have to keep going. So it accelerates the way that the population can respond, right? And there's an awful lot of that going on. Busan is building a floating city, and the sort of accelerated innovation, I think I would say, is phenomenal. So it's I think it's a pretty important part of this wider agenda. My third argument is tsunami of new pressures on public procurement. I think I mentioned that in the last 10 years, we're asking procurement to do everything. And maybe that's okay, right? It's public money. It should be levering social value. But are we equipped to do it? So lots of interesting experiments going on. Progressive procurement policy in New Zealand is one of them, for example, not popular amongst everybody, as you can imagine, because it's set-asides and all that sort of thing come to mind, right, in the old industrial policy days. So I think, you know, these things are coming at us. Can we speed up the process, these pathways to policy innovation? Can these models help us think through it? What's going to happen? Is it just going to be a spike and then back to the old ways? Or is it sort of a cyclical set of conditions that's going to lead us to a new equilibrium, if you want to use that term? Leadership, lots of people are mentioning that, but I think we'll get further into that with some of the other speakers. Who's driving that policy? What's coming politically? Politics does matter in it, of course, right? I mean, we've had a Labour government in New Zealand for 6 years, and that broader outcomes shift came during that time period. And now we're on the verge of a right-leaning national government, and I think they're going to undo some of it. So that matters, you know, if you're sort of, I'm sort of neutral on these things, but knowing that there's things we can do, I think, to sort of future-proof our procurement policy. I hope they don't undo all of it. Just really quickly, I talk a lot about procurement and AI these days, because I just think that it's coming, it's sort of running behind us, tapping us on the shoulders and say, hey, pay attention here. And most of us don't understand it. Maybe you use ChatGPT, maybe you don't, but these things are happening. And there's a lot of opportunity for public procurement and innovation in this space. And if we're going to accelerate how we move through the public procurement potential opportunities, we need to look at this, because maybe there are ways to leapfrog. Maybe there are things we can do easier, faster, better. AI can train basic procurement, no problem, right? Why not just go straight to the mobile phone instead of putting in landlines and then going to mobile phones? That's what's happened in lots of places around the world, right? So it's sort of part of that big wave that's coming, I think. And some of us in this procurement space are thinking quite a bit about all these different elements. These are just some of the reports that have come out of New Zealand recently. A lot of grappling with it. New Zealand's not minded to put in much regulation typically. UK's doing more, European Union's doing more, so we'll see what happens there. And of course, climate warming, I like to use that word, it's a little more jarring than climate change. Climate change could mean better, right? Climate change. Climate warming, I'm not so sure that that's a good thing. And we talk a lot about managed retreat, because in the Pacific and even in New Zealand and in lots of places with waters rising, some islands are going to no longer exist. So we are having to think through public sector procurement in a manner of, well, what are we going to do with the islands that we work with? And this is the Tuvalu foreign minister. You may have seen the little YouTube video. Gives a recorded speech to COP26 in Glasgow. It's really quite remarkable. He's standing in rising waters, right? We're sinking, but so is everybody else, and he's right there. There's lots of places that are going to be inundated with water. So these are some of these big issues that we have to think about. Can we move faster to relational contracting or not? Can we do some of this faster? Because these are right around the corner. There's known and a lot of unknown costs, and procurement has to be ready now. Oh, I didn't mean for that to happen, but never mind. So those are my three arguments on the left-hand side. If I came back to my original sets of conditions, and we talked a bit about this yesterday, I would add place as being really important. People in Tuvalu don't want to move, right? But we may have to procure them new places to live, and there's been agreements with Australia for various islands, and there's going to be a lot of people moving around. So thinking through how those systems are going to work and just being better and better prepared for that. No system is ideal, but choosing consciously those steps to different forms of innovation is going to be important. We're getting lots of information over this conference about the mechanisms of how to do it, which sets fit with which conditions within the wider system. And this unprecedented pressure, for good and for bad, I think, on the procurement idea and its practice. It's a new time. It's exciting. We've all come together to talk about this. I don't think we can wait to do things in the way that we've always done them. Things are going to happen too fast, right? So what are the accelerated approaches? And I think that's all I have to say. Please come and visit New Zealand if you get a chance. That's Queenstown. And thank you very much for listening. Was I close to 20 minutes? I lost it.
Just perfect. Barbara, in South Africa, we have a town in the Eastern Cape called Queenstown. I can assure you it looks nothing like the picture you put up there. I know because I come from Queenstown, now called Komani. I'm going to digress for a little bit. Short little history lesson. In 1823, in a rugby match in the town of Rugby in the United Kingdom, William Webb Ellis picked up the soccer ball and ran with it. The year was 1823, and that's how the game of rugby was born. Until 1994, of the home unions, together with the others that played the game of rugby, the Springboks, statistically, were the most successful. By that I mean, Of the games with each country they had played, the Springboks had won more than they had lost to every nation. 24 June 1995, in the first World Cup final, in the first World Cup the Springboks participated in, they beat the All Blacks 15-12. That game marked the end of the amateur era of rugby as a sport. The following year, 1996, rugby became a professional sport. The first international series the Springboks participated in, it was in South Africa, Durban, Johannesburg, and Pretoria. The All Blacks got out of the starting blocks first. They beat us for the first time ever in the history of the rivalry between the two sides, 2-1. We lost in Durban. We lost the second game at Loftus Versfeld here in Pretoria, and the Springboks lost for the first time ever to the All Blacks. Of course, it was a consolation victory at Ellis Park a week on. The first game between the two sides was in 1921 in Dunedin. Springboks won that game. In the professional era, it has largely been one-way traffic. The All Blacks have had our number for quite a while. The biggest loss between the two sides was in 2016 in Albany, under the stewardship of Alistair Coetzee, where the Springboks lost a record 57 points to 0. It was and remains the Springboks' lowest point in their rugby history. Enter Rassie Erasmus, of course, 2018. Not only did we beat the All Blacks that year, but it was to lay a marker for what would happen in 2019. Yes, we lost to the All Blacks in the first game of that Rugby World Cup in Japan, the first time a team that would go on to win a World Cup losing in the pool stages. We won the World Cup. 28 October 2023, 200 years from the day, rather 200 years from when William Webellis picked up the trophy. In other words, the game of rugby was 200 years old, the biggest rivalry in the sport. Springboks versus the All Blacks met in what they're too, the biggest game ever to be played, a Rugby World Cup final on neutral ground between these two sides. It was always there for history. All Blacks, 3 World Cups. Springboks, 3 World Cups. To boot, an opportunity for Siyamthanda Kolisi to make history. And the difference was 1 point. Barbara, to you and many New Zealanders, there is no greater pride than to be a South African supporter and engage in the Springbok All Black rivalry. It has been heated, it has been testy, but my goodness, are the All Blacks good for the Springboks, as one would imagine the Springboks are good for the All Blacks. Please take this message home to Sam Kame and Teen and say, we thank them for their rivalry, and we thank the entire New Zealand community for how they have been gracious in responding to the Springbok victory, and it certainly is something that has not gone unnoticed here. Back to procurement. In a conversation, and this is me now trying to get everybody to engage in the question and answer session. If you have a question for Prof. Gio, please do so. If you have one for Dr. Barbara, just confirm and one will come up and respond. First Gio, then Barbara. WTO, GPA, South Africa is not a member. And I would love for Shope to have heard this, but she was just whispering to me now that it would open South African markets up to simply be cannibalized, for instance, by the Chinese markets or the US markets, in the sense that there isn't a reasonable player in the South African market or economy that can genuinely win. Certainly not a federal contract in America, simply because of the sheer numbers at play there. But of course, the opposite is not true. The question then I would have, let's assume that to be true, and I don't engage it for too much. Is there not, at a minimum, scope for South Africa to be an observer at the WTO in the GPA, particularly to maximize our membership, but also to learn international best practices as they pertain to public procurement, more especially in the nascent conversations around procurement and innovation? That is something that I would appreciate hearing from you. With respect to Teponi Kokiri, the Ministry of Maori Development, just a question. If 8% of total procurement spend is to be set aside, if you like, for the Maori community, how much as a percentage of the total New Zealand population are the Maori people to the New Zealand population, just to understand the parity? 16%, that's the answer, because I just wanted to understand the true value of what that 8% would be. Sure. Are there any other questions? I think now I've been talking for too long and there should be people with questions here. There's a question there. Sir, any other question? Keep the hands up, please. Of course, you know the rule, right?
Thanks, Dr. Allen.
Please speak closer to the mic, sir, please.
Presentation. My question is about indigenous economy. You mentioned indigenous economy, and how do you explain that in the South African context? We talk more about IKS, indigenous knowledge systems. So I'm interested in you just elaborating briefly on the indigenous economy and public procurement and innovation.
That's for? The question is for? Barbara.
Yes.
For Barbara. Sir, please repeat your question.
You mentioned indigenous economy. In South Africa, we talk about indigenous knowledge systems. I'm interested in you explaining briefly indigenous economy, public procurement, and innovation in your context.
Do you want me to do that one?
No, not yet, not yet. Sean, online?
So, question for Barbara. So Barbara mentioned that there are no regulations, there's no procurement law in New Zealand. Are there rules governing procurement of innovation? And how has New Zealand experienced that challenge, if any, moving from a transactional type focus to a relationship type focus as outlined by Professor Kino?
So you got that, Barbara? Here, you got that. Any other questions? The gentleman in the middle, in the blue jacket. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Chairperson. This is for Prof. Kuno. You mentioned this relationship procurement. To what extent should it be, and how do you relate it to our legislative framework? Yeah, I think I should leave it at that, because you said there should be a network of these service providers